On the night of March 14, 1968, a low, steady rain settled over a small American fire support position in Quang Tri Province, a few kilometers south of the demilitarized zone. The rain was not heavy enough to flood the ground, but it was persistent, soaking fatigues, softening the dirt and dulling sound. For infantrymen on the perimeter, it meant a miserable night of listening into darkness. For the mortar section dug into shallow pits near the center of the position, it meant something worse: reduced visibility, unreliable illumination, and the constant awareness that if contact came, it would come suddenly. The position itself was temporary. It had been scraped out of elevated ground, overlooking a shallow valley used by local farmers during the dry season, and by North Vietnamese infiltration elements during the wet one. The Americans called it a fire base, but it lacked the permanence the name suggested. There were no concrete bunkers, no steel overhead cover, just sandbags, packed earth, and the assumption that the unit would move again within days. The mortar section consisted of 8 men and 2 81mm tubes. Their job was indirect fire support, high-angle explosive rounds lobbed toward targets they would never see. Mortars were one of the most flexible weapons available to American infantry in Vietnam. They could be set up quickly, adjusted rapidly, and fired from positions where artillery could not be brought forward. They were also magnets for enemy attention. North Vietnamese forces understood mortar positions well. A mortar pit was noisy, predictable, and limited in mobility once firing began. Counter-mortar fire was a standard tactic. If the enemy could locate a tube, they could range it with mortars of their own, or target it with recoilless rifles, rockets, or sappers. The man responsible for one of the tubes that night was a private first class named Daniel Mercer. He was 20 years old and had been in country for less than 4 months. His job was assistant gunner. He handled ammunition, adjusted elevation, relayed fire commands, and kept count of rounds fired. He had been trained at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where mortar ranges were dry, flat, and predictable. Vietnam was none of those things. Mercer sat on an overturned ammo crate under a poncho, helmet tilted forward, listening to the rain strike nylon and metal. His hands were already dirty despite the rain. Mortar work was constant contact with mud, grease, powder residue, and damp packaging. The rounds themselves were olive drab cylinders with fins, packed in fiber containers that disintegrated when soaked. Shortly after midnight, the listening posts on the perimeter reported movement. Not contact, just movement. That distinction mattered. Units in Vietnam rarely received clear warnings. More often there were fragments of information, a sound, a silhouette, a wire disturbance, enough to raise tension, not enough to justify firing. The Fire Direction Center passed a warning to the mortar section to stand by. Mercer rose from the crate and moved to the tube. The base plate was already sunk slightly into the mud despite attempts to brace it with sandbags. He wiped rainwater from the sight and checked the elevation setting by feel more than sight. The gunner beside him adjusted the bipod, compensating for ground that had softened since dusk. Mortar crews worked mostly by muscle memory. In darkness and rain, there was no time to read markings carefully. Each adjustment had to be trusted. Mortars in Vietnam were often employed defensively, particularly at night. If an enemy force attempted to probe or assault a position, mortars could blanket approach routes with fragmentation rounds, breaking up formations before they reached the wire. Unlike artillery, mortars could be walked in quickly, shifting fire by tens of meters in seconds. That speed came at a cost. Mortar sections operated close to friendly lines. Errors were catastrophic. At 00:47 hours, the first perimeter flare went up. The sudden white light briefly turned the rain into silver threads. Beyond the wire, movement became visible in flashes, figures dropping prone, shadows frozen mid-step, then darkness again as the flare burned out. The radio crackled. The Fire Direction Center transmitted grid coordinates and a fire mission designation. High explosive, 2 rounds, adjust fire. Mercer reached for the first round, pulling it free from its container. The fins were slick. He wiped them quickly on his sleeve and handed the round to the gunner. The gunner checked the fuse by touch, then nodded. "Drop," he said. The round slid down the tube. A dull thump followed as the propellant ignited and sent it arcing into the dark. Mercer immediately grabbed the second round. Mortar fire was indirect by definition. The crew never saw the impact. They relied entirely on observers and radio corrections. Seconds passed, then the radio crackled again. "Add 50, left 20, repeat." They adjusted, another round dropped, another thump. Beyond the perimeter, explosions bloomed invisibly, their flashes muted by rain and terrain. The sound arrived later, rolling back across the valley. The enemy did not immediately respond. That worried Mercer more than incoming fire would have. North Vietnamese units often tested positions deliberately, probing with small elements to draw fire. Once American mortars revealed their location and firing pattern, enemy countermortar teams could begin ranging. Countermortar engagements in Vietnam were brief and violent. There was no prolonged exchange. Once rounds started falling accurately, survival depended on speed, dispersion, and luck. At 01:03, the first enemy mortar round landed. It struck outside the wire, short of the American position. The explosion was deeper, heavier than the 60mm rounds Mercer had heard before, likely an 82mm or larger. The second round landed closer. The third round landed inside the perimeter. The radio lit up with overlapping voices. Perimeter units reported incoming. The Fire Direction Center ordered immediate displacement after firing a final defensive concentration. Mercer's hands moved automatically. He passed rounds. He counted them aloud. He shouted numbers into the rain so the gunner could hear. Mortar crews in Vietnam were trained to fire rapidly, but there were limits. Barrels overheated, base plates shifted, accuracy degraded. The enemy rounds walked inward. One exploded close enough to shower the pit with dirt and fragments. Mercer felt impacts strike his helmet and shoulders. Something hot burned his forearm. He ignored it. They fired the last round. "Displace," the gunner yelled. They lifted the tube together. It was heavier than it should have been, packed with mud. They staggered toward a secondary position marked earlier that day, slipping on wet ground, carrying a weapon that could not be dropped. Another enemy round landed where they had been seconds before. Mortar operators were rarely discussed in popular accounts of the Vietnam War, but their experience captured many of the conflict's defining features: fighting an unseen enemy, operating on fragmentary information, and being targeted not as individuals but as systems. North Vietnamese doctrine emphasized neutralizing American fire support. Mortars, artillery, and air power were the greatest advantages U.S. forces possessed. Enemy units could not match them symmetrically, so they attacked them indirectly. Countermortar teams were trained to observe muzzle flashes, sound signatures, and firing rhythms. Even in rain and darkness, experienced crews could bracket a position in minutes. For American mortar operators, this meant every fire mission carried risk. Firing saved lives on the perimeter, but it also painted a target on the pit. Mercer and his crew reached the alternate position and slammed the baseplate into the mud. The gunner adjusted elevation without looking. Mercer fed rounds. They fired again. This time the enemy fire shifted away. Either the countermortar team lost track of them, or higher command redirected the attack elsewhere. The rain intensified, masking sound and flash. By 02:15, the movement beyond the wire ceased. The perimeter reported no breach. No friendly casualties were confirmed. The mortar section remained on alert until dawn. At first light, the damage became visible. Several craters dotted the interior of the position. One pit had taken a direct hit after its crew displaced. Equipment was shredded. The men were shaken but alive. Mercer noticed the burn on his forearm had blistered. He hadn't remembered when it happened. This was typical. Many mortar crew injuries in Vietnam went unrecorded or were treated as minor. Burns from hot barrels, fragment cuts, hearing damage from repeated concussions. These were accepted as part of the job. Later that morning, intelligence reports suggested the night's contact had been a reconnaissance in force rather than a full assault. The enemy had tested the perimeter, drawn fire, and withdrawn. From a tactical perspective, it was a success for both sides. The Americans held the position. The North Vietnamese gathered information. For Mercer, it was simply another night added to a growing collection of indistinct memories. Rain, darkness, radio static, the dull thump of rounds leaving the tube, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond sight, other men were reacting to forces neither side could fully control. Mortars were impersonal weapons. The men who fired them rarely saw the effects. This distance created a different kind of psychological burden. Infantrymen remembered faces, mortar operators remembered coordinates. As the unit prepared to move days later, the mortar section packed up their tubes, wiped mud from equipment, and loaded rounds into helicopters bound for another temporary position. The valley returned to silence. For Mercer, the war would continue for 8 more months, mostly at night, mostly unseen, measured not in ground taken but in fire missions completed and positions survived. Indirect fire rarely made headlines. But without it, many perimeters would not have held. And many nights in Vietnam would have ended very differently.